In every crime, there's a reflection. A motive hidden in plain sight. A truth distorted by silence. Welcome to the Forensic Mirror, where psychology meets evidence, and every case reveals more than just what happened, it reveals why. Welcome back, truth seekers. You're now tuned into the Forensic Mirror, where shadows speak and silence is never innocent. Each week, we peel back the layers of guilt, decode the psychological fingerprints, and stare straight into the eyes of calculated chaos. This isn't just true crime. It's truth, dissected. Madness, mapped. And justice, relentlessly pursued. Episode 5, Zodiac Killer, Why He Did It, The Twisted Motives of America's Most Elusive Killer. Welcome back to the Forensic Mirror. Today I will be exploring the Zodiac Killer's complex motives, his creation of a notorious identity, and how his communication with the media amplified his infamy. I will cover the timeline of attacks, his chilling messages, and the psychological drive behind his crimes. Stay tuned while we get started.
When people talk about the Zodiac Killer, they often focus on the horrifying details of the murders or the frustration of law enforcement. But to really understand the case, you have to talk about why he did it, because his motives were as layered and complicated as his infamous ciphers. This wasn't just a killer who wanted to stay hidden. This was a man who desperately needed to be recognized, who created a terrifying brand for himself and used the media as his stage. So, when we look at the birth of the name and the terror timeline, we need to look at the most important thing to remember about this killer, is that he gave himself the title, Zodiac. He didn't wait for the press or the police to name him. He created his own chilling identity, complete with a signature symbol, a circle with a cross running through it. This choice immediately shows he intended to be famous and recognized, not just a passing criminal statistic. The terror attributed to the Zodiac officially began in Northern California with a short, terrifying string of confirmed assaults between late 1968 and late 1969. Investigators agree on 7 confirmed victims, 5 of whom died. They believe these events started on December 20, 1968, when David Arthur Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen, a high school couple, were shot and killed on Lake Herman Road in Benicia. The pattern was established: young couples in secluded spots. This continued in July 1969 at Blue Rock Springs Park in Vallejo, where Michael Reno Mago and Darlene Elizabeth Farron were shot. A shift occurred on September 27, 1969, when the method changed from shooting to stabbing at Lake Berryessa, targeting Brian Calvin Hartnell and Cecilia and Shepard. So, on October 11, 1969, the killer moved the terror into the city, shooting and killing cab driver Paul Lee Stein in the Presidio Heights neighborhood of San Francisco. While the official body count is 7, 5 dead, 2 survived, the man who called himself Zodiac would soon claim a number far greater, claiming 37 victims. So, what truly distinguished the Zodiac Killer from other murderers? And why communication was the real crime? It was not only the sheer brutality of his attacks, it was his series of sociopathic letters that he sent to newspapers. These communications formed the very core of his criminal enterprise. Through the letters, the Zodiac ensured that his reign of terror extended well beyond the immediate sites of violence, infiltrating the consciousness of the public, the police, and especially the journalists who covered the case. The Zodiac did not limit himself to a single newspaper. Although he wrote to several publications, he repeatedly chose the San Francisco Chronicle as his main stage, sending 17 of the 22 known communications to this outlet. This targeted approach made the Chronicle a central part of his ongoing campaign for notoriety and control. The immediacy with which the Zodiac began corresponding with law enforcement and the media demonstrated that his primary reward was not merely the act of violence itself. Instead, it was the attention, influence, and public reaction that followed each crime. Unlike most killers who seek to avoid detection, the Zodiac actively engaged with the press, craving the spotlight, and the widespread fear his messages could instill. The investigation and the sustained anxiety within the community became integral to the Zodiac persona. Without the media to broadcast his words, his myth would have quickly faded. This reliance on external recognition exposed a deep, narcissistic drive that fueled his entire crime spree. So, when we look at the stated motives in his letters or what Zodiac wanted us to believe, we see that the Zodiac Killer was unusual because he provided two different, powerful justifications for his actions. One was simple and chillingly sadistic. The other was elaborate and spiritual. So, this was a simple shock to law enforcement and newscasters. He claimed that his first motive for these killings is because, and I quote, "I like killing because it is fun." Talk about sadistic. After the first few attacks, Zodiac sent his first major coded message, known as the Z408 cipher, to Bay Area newspapers. When a teacher and his wife cracked this first cipher in 1969, the message revealed his core motive in shocking, simple terms: "I like killing people because it's so much fun." This statement was intended to maximize fear and position the killer as an entity outside the bounds of normal human morality. By describing the act of murder as fun, he cut through any potential psychological or social explanation, defining himself as a raw sadist who killed for pure, simple enjoyment. This immediate, visceral motivation provided him with the immediate rush he sought from the violence. The second motive was looked at a more spiritual fantasy, slaves for the afterlife, as he called it. The simple sadism of fun was quickly layered with an elaborate fantasy. Zodiac claimed he was collecting his victims to serve as his slaves for the afterlife or paradise. This spiritual claim was not just casual talk. It was central to his self-image. It was confirmed decades later in 2020 when code experts finally cracked the infamous 340 cipher, 51 years after it was sent to the San Francisco Chronicle. The decoded message contained the line, "I am not afraid of the gas chamber because it will send me to paradise." This spiritual layer is a clear psychological tool. By defining the murders as a path to a supernatural reward, the killer transformed his random, brutal acts into a crucial, grand mission. This gave him a feeling of omnipotence. The spiritual fantasy is the internal justification he needed to perform such horrific violence. If the fun motive was the immediate rush of sadism, the slave motive was the long-term psychological structure that allowed him to see himself as something more than just a street criminal. This high-minded purpose explained why he claimed he needed to kill 37 people. The high murder count was directly linked to his reward, elevating him to a powerful, mythological figure rather than an ordinary perpetrator. Beyond the stated reasons, the most telling aspect of the Zodiac case is the functional motivation, the psychological needs satisfied by his actions, particularly his communications and use of codes. This cat-and-mouse game he played screamed that he craved recognition. He loved playing a cat-and-mouse game with the authorities. Instead of concealing his involvement, he went out of his way to publicize it. His letters often contained cryptic symbols and taunts alluding to his planned actions, ensuring he controlled the flow of information and maintained a constant level of hysteria. This control over the narrative became the new motive. His focus was not just on the victims, but on his pursuers. He ensured he remained the central, terrifying figure by stretching out his communications, often timing them strategically to maintain media coverage. This demonstrates an intense need for power over the police and the media, which suggests that if the newspapers or law enforcement stopped paying attention, the thrill of the motive would cease to exist. This type of criminal behavior is less about the violence itself and more about the psychological warfare waged against an entire community. A killer seeking this level of control will use terror threats, such as talking about bombing a school bus, to paralyze the community. This expands his sense of power from targeting individuals to gripping the entire Bay Area population, feeding the feelings of omnipotence noted in his psychological profile. The Zodiac's decision to include complex cryptograms, such as the Z408 and Z340 ciphers, was perhaps the clearest window into his extreme ego. The codes were not just puzzles. They were an elaborate, self-congratulatory display designed to test and ultimately humiliate law enforcement and code-breaking experts. The sheer difficulty of the task forced local law enforcement to call upon specialized agencies, including FBI cryptanalysts, to unravel the complex codes. The Z408 cipher, for example, used more than 50 shapes and symbols to represent the 26 letters of the alphabet. When amateur codebreakers successfully solved the Z408, they had to make educated guesses based on the sender's personality. They assumed correctly that he would begin the message with the word I, because the content of his known letters strongly suggested the killer had a huge ego. The codes validated his self-image of superiority over society and the authorities. They showed the immense effort he put into crafting this showcase for his intelligence. The dedication to creating such complex codes suggests that the struggle to craft the cipher was immensely rewarding in itself. It served as an intellectual pedestal, offering a psychological victory, the police having to beg for help or the code remaining unsolved for decades, that strongly reinforced his sense of grandiosity. A person compensating for deep personal inadequacy will naturally gravitate toward activities that allow them to prove their superiority. Complex cryptograms are the perfect vehicle for this, allowing him to feel like the sole master of the game. When we look at the mind of the killer, we need to grasp the complexity of the Zodiac's motives. A psychiatrist at the California Medical Facility in Vacaville analyzed the killer's messages early in the investigation, providing a compelling picture of the man hiding behind the myth. Isolation, inadequacy, and the need for a myth. The analysis painted the Zodiac as someone you would expect to be brooding and isolated. This suggests a man detached from typical social structures and relationships. The psychiatrist also speculated that the killer's written praise of murder over sex was an expression of inadequacy. This profile suggests that the core motive was primarily compensatory. Imagine a person who feels entirely invisible, perhaps a failure in their job, their social life, or their personal relationships. The Zodiac persona is the complete opposite of that failure. He is powerful, feared, intelligent, and central to every newspaper headline. The violence and the myth-building were the desperate ways an isolated man attempted to achieve the status and power that life had otherwise denied him. He essentially exchanged real-world failure and obscurity for terrifying, public notoriety. The professional analysis concluding that the writer felt omnipotent, that is, he felt like an all-powerful god, based on his fantasy about collecting spiritual slaves. This belief system naturally fueled the slave motive. Furthermore, the extensive use of cryptic symbols and codes suggested he may have had schizotypal thinking, believing in secret messages or conspiracies. This means he might have truly believed the world was full of secret patterns or hidden enemies only he could understand. This way of thinking would make his elaborate symbols, like the crosshair and the ciphers, intensely meaningful to him, regardless of whether they made sense to others. This provided the crucial internal validation he needed to sustain his powerful, unique killer persona. If the Zodiac's primary reason was to grow to be a legend, fame, and power, he couldn't simply rely on the 7 confirmed victims. To satisfy his immense ego and maintain his omnipotent self-image, he engaged in motive inflation, vastly exaggerating his crimes to maximize fear and expand his myth. The starkest example of this inflation is the immense gap between the confirmed facts and his own boastful claims. While investigators confirmed 7 assault victims, the Zodiac claimed in his letters to have killed 37 victims. This inflated number served the functional motive perfectly. It terrorized the population far beyond the Bay Area, ensured his legend grew exponentially, and satisfied the stated motive of maximizing the number of slaves he would have in his afterlife paradise. The motive was not just to kill, but to be seen as having killed far more, thus increasing his stature in the public eye and fulfilling his grandiosity. To further cement his position as America's greatest criminal mastermind, Zodiac attempted to absorb older, famous unsolved cases into his mythology. Most notably, he claimed responsibility for the 1966 murder of Sherry Jo Bates in Riverside, California, which was geographically distant from his confirmed attacks. In a 1971 letter to the Los Angeles Times, Zodiac claimed responsibility for the Bates murder, stating authorities were only finding the easy ones, and that there are a hell of a lot more down there. However, Authorities have consistently maintained that there is no solid evidence linking the Bates killing to the later Zodiac murders, and they strongly believe the killer was local to Riverside County. The act of claiming the Bates murder years later reveals a desperate need to expand the Zodiac myth and control the historical record. By trying to absorb a famous, unsolved murder, he was attempting to prove his legend was bigger than any one jurisdiction, fulfilling the motive of fame and power even during periods when he was not actively committing confirmed crimes. If a serial killer's primary reward is attention, they must constantly find ways to innovate to maintain that attention, even if it means retroactively claiming older, high-profile cases. This ensures he remains the undisputed subject of terror and investigation. So, here is the complex truth of why. The analysis of the Zodiac Killer's correspondence and criminal actions reveals that he was driven not by a single impulse, but by a carefully constructed system of psychological defense. The evidence suggests a powerful overlap in motivation. The spiritual fantasy gave him the reason to kill, while the need for fame and control gave him the method of communication and escalation. The fun motive satisfied the immediate, cruel, sadistic impulse, while the slave motive satisfied the long-term, grandiose need for meaning and power omnipotence. These two ideas were simply different facets of the same core psychological need: to feel important. The true motive for the Zodiac Killer was the creation and protection of a myth. He wanted to be a powerful, clever, and immortal figure who could speak directly to the press, challenge the FBI, and talk about heaven and hell. The murder was the vehicle, but the myth was the destination. Ultimately, the Zodiac Killer's success was tied directly to his motives. By choosing communication over concealment, and by focusing on fear and control over simple violence, he ensured his legacy. His motives were so theatrical and narcissistic that the man who wanted the biggest spotlight achieved the greatest, most enduring level of notoriety in American crime history, even without ever being identified. He manipulated the public, police, and media into building the legend that remains one of the world's most fascinating and terrifying unsolved mysteries.
And so, as we close episode 5, in the end, the Zodiac Killer's legacy is not just one's violence, but of a meticulously crafted legend that continues to haunt the American imagination. His crimes, letters, and symbols were not only acts of brutality, but also deliberate tools in the construction of his enduring myth. By weaving together fear, ambiguity, and his own hunger for significance, the Zodiac ensured that his name would live on, an enigma that remains unsolved and endlessly analyzed, a chilling testament to the power of myth in shaping history. Stay tuned for the next episode, where we explore more crime stories across the globe. Thank you for listening.